Revelation 2750. From the 23rd of May 1943. Medicine of Grace, Love, Work and Prayer. This is the most effective means of grace that the human being practices: love, for an activity of love provides him with unmeasured strength, and the strength from God is a grace which inevitably leads towards perfection. If the human being practices love, he will also strive for contact with God, who is love in himself, and everything that calls for God will be grasped by him and granted with his grace. The human being has to give something if he wants to receive love, if he wants to receive love from God again. And God's grace is evidence of his love, which is available to all people if only they want to receive. And they express their will through loving activity, which then also secures them an abundance of grace. Another means of grace is prayer, which in turn expresses the will to God, which testifies to his helplessness, his weakness, in which the human being turns to God for his support, for strength or grace. Anyone who sincerely calls upon God for his help for his earthly way of life, who entrusts himself to him in all his weakness, is mercifully and lovingly drawn to his heart by the Father in heaven. He provides for him. He supplies him with strength so that he can fulfill God's will. He constantly stays with him with his grace, and thus his life will also be an activity of love, because the strength from God stimulates love, because the strength from God is his emanation of love which impels love again. Love and prayer are the most effective means of grace which facilitate the human being's path of earthly life and ensure complete success for his soul. For God himself is with those who live in love and take refuge in prayer, who are therefore in closest contact with him and whom he will therefore never leave without help, because they belong to him, because they long for him and have therefore found their way back to him from whom they originated. But God also gives his grace to people who are still distant from him by constantly guiding them into opportunities where they can acquire grace, by constantly giving them opportunities to take refuge in him or to work in love. Yet he does not force people to do so, but leaves it up to them whether they should use the grace flowing to them or not. God's love and grace wants to embrace all people, yet the human will has to agree to use it. Otherwise God's grace cannot flow to it, even though it is available to it unmeasured. People who have no contact with God through loving activity or conscious prayer do not feel God's grace so noticeably either, for what comes from God can only be felt in the heart. The strength from God only ever impels the heart to become lovingly active. Only then does the life force come into action that the human being carries out what his heart impels him to do. And thus all grace is the means to inner spiritual perfection. Grace is an aid to the soul's ascent and is therefore only felt by those who desire ascent. The others, however, pay no attention to it. They ignore it when the voice of the heart speaks to them and wants to impel them into loving activity. Thus, when God's grace wants to flow to them, they close themselves off to it and don't use it, consequently it cannot take effect in them. However, the human being cannot attain spiritual perfection without God's grace, and therefore his spiritual degree of maturity will remain low as long as he does not make use of God's grace. As long as he does not ask for God's grace and acquire it through eager activity of love. For these are the most effective means of grace which inevitably lead the human being upwards, which guarantee his perfection. Amen.